Today I wanted to explain to you all what the meaning is of ASL and deaf culture to me. What my opinions are, what are my personal feelings related to it, and then of course also being a CODA. I was reflecting on my own life and thinking, okay, I have a few things that I could talk about that I would share with you. I thought about what was my connection to this and realized that it's identity, my personal identity, what my opinions are of myself, how I interact and socialize with deaf people and hearing people, and then also how I feel about myself and how I try to handle the different cultural situations between hearing and deaf people. I was thinking about why this is, and I thought I would go ahead and explain it to you. I won't be able to explain absolutely everything in depth today, so that means you could probably expect more interesting videos connected to this topic. You may notice that my ASL isn't perfect. And the reason for this is because I come from a PSE background. What does PSE mean? It means Pidgin Sign English. It's not completely perfectly English. Like back then, like it was a lot more serious with signed English. And then when I went into my IPP, my interpreter preparation program, to learn to become an interpreter, I went into my ASL 3 class, and my deaf teacher caught me using too much English grammar and some English signs and told me, hey, you need to stop that. So then ASL linguistics was a huge help. It helped me change my grammar and word order around to reflect ASL better. When I think about my identity, I think about the time I spent growing up in school, especially in elementary school, from kindergarten to about 5th grade. I realize that I do have Hispanic heritage and I have a Hispanic last name. However, that doesn't really come up all that much when I think about my identity because the language I used at home was sign language. Wasn't necessarily American Sign Language exactly, but I was using PSE daily, regularly. And this is because my mom went to mainstream school, meaning she was a deaf kid in a hearing school, so that meant her sign was more English. But as she interacted with deaf people as an adult, her signing style changed. However, my dad, who went to a deaf school, was getting ASL instruction, but once he met my mom and married her, their sign styles mixed with each other. And then, of course, that explains the influence on me and my sisters. When I went to school, I would sometimes on parents' nights see students with their parents, and there would be black families and white families and Hispanic families, some Asian families. Sometimes I would hear different languages being spoken, but never once did I see anybody signing with their parents. And that meant that I was the only one with deaf parents. That's the truth. That made me feel out of the ordinary. I was different from everybody else. My sister wasn't going to my school and wouldn't until after I turned 10 and we moved. That meant that I was the only one who signed with his parents. I could see the kids talking with their parents and extended family, and that just really highlighted the difference. Their lives were not like mine, and at the time I thought, well, that's fine, I guess. My parents are deaf, and that's different. I do have a very small connection with the Hispanic side of my identity, and that's mainly through my dad and his side of the family. He's from Texas, and his parents spoke Spanish. They were both hearing. Now I'm talking about my grandparents on his side of the family. They spoke Spanish. When my grandmother was still alive, gosh, that must have been 20 years ago or more. I honestly cannot remember. I remember one memory that I had. My dad would come home from work, he would eat, take a shower, and say that, hey, I'm going to go call my mom. And then my mom said, hey, listen, while he's on the phone with grandma, you cannot go and bother him. And I said, okay. But sometimes when I'd go to the bathroom, which was right next to the door to my parents' room, where my parents slept, of course, I could hear through the door my dad's conversation with my grandma. He had this big rotary phone, and it was incredibly loud. There was a dial on the receiver that you could use to increase the sound to the level where my dad could hear it. So that meant I could hear my grandmother's voice. So then I would be listening in, and he'd catch me, and he'd say, "Hey, do you want to talk to Grandma?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know. I don't talk Spanish." So then he'd go, "It's okay, don't worry about it," and hand it to me, and I'd say, "Hola, Grandma," and I heard her sweet old lady's voice, but at this point in time, I just don't remember what she said. That's kind of just like a small example of my connection to deaf culture, or other Hispanic culture. And sometimes my dad would say silly things in Spanish like malo, malo, que malo, but never really went any further than that in Spanish because the language we used at home was sign language. Why do I consider deaf people to be my family? It doesn't matter if they're older people, if they're the same age as me, or they're younger. I feel like I have a connection to them. They're, in a sense, my extended family, and that's because I would go to deaf clubs, deaf church, and because of those two, I would interact a lot with the deaf families from those clubs and the church. They would have CODA kids themselves. Sometimes there'd be a boy and a girl, or two boys and two girls, or just a different family makeup. I'd see them during birthday parties, during Christmas, during the summer holidays. We would hang out, and this went on until I was about maybe 13 or 14, and then those interactions started to decrease, especially after we moved from Tennessee to Georgia. We just got to know different groups, and we had different schedules. Even though we were only 25 minutes away, there was still a pretty big change. Moreover, you know how teenagers will lose interest and change their interests, and I too felt that link beginning to dissolve. But during that time of my life that I was talking about earlier, I would go hang out with at the pool with CODA kids while the deaf parents would be talking, and they'd come over, or we'd come over there, and the kids would be falling asleep while the deaf parents would still be talking. So my CODA friend and I would just be sitting there and playing video games, and then like his parents would say, "Hey, you got to call the pizza place and have them deliver to us." And sometimes I'd be like, "Oh, do you want to go?" "Oh, no, it's your turn." So then we would just play rock paper scissors to determine who was going to go, and that'd be pretty funny. God, that was that was a long time ago. But that too is part of my identity. I'm a CODA, and that means I sign, come from deaf culture. So then that led me to think about which languages I feel more comfortable or less comfortable using. Now I have 3 languages. Obviously I sign, I speak English, and now I have a new language, and that is Dutch. That is Nederlands. I'm still learning that. Pretty soon I'll be taking my B2 exams. Wish me luck. I may need it. It's hard. I'm not going to be explaining that part too much right now. I've noticed that while growing up I felt more comfortable signing because it was familiar because of family, and especially even when I used to work at Sorensen. I'm done with that now. That's in the past for me now. But last year was my 5th year working at Sorensen. I was a video relay interpreter. At times, however, it would depend on the time of the year, but it happened on some sort of a regular basis where I would find myself chatting with a deaf customer who was on the other side of the screen, especially after the hearing person had already disconnected. The deaf customer would want to continue chatting. And it would take maybe 5 minutes, usually, but to be honest, it would sometimes run over 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I would let them know, hey, because I saw on my program that the call had been running too long, and I'd say, hey, I gotta go. And the deaf customer's like, I know, you're an interpreter and you have to get going. Thank you for chatting with me, though, and spending time with me, and that made me feel better. I wished then that I could continue chatting because it was comfortable for me as much as it was for them. To be honest, I do miss that, having that sort of comfy chat with a deaf person, even if I didn't know who they were. I was providing a service, but I felt like I wanted to strengthen my connection with deaf culture, and that's part of the reason why I did that as well. It was really special. And then I thought about, how is my feeling of comfort with English? How does that work? I thought about when I was growing up, and this is something that's still going on now. And then, of course, here in the Netherlands, a lot of people do speak English as well. There are some people here from America, there's some people from the United Kingdom, Canada, and other English-speaking places, and South Africa as well. I've met people from Turkey and other countries. They speak English as well. However, I'm not talking too much in detail about that, but the point is that I would watch movies and watch TV and go to school and work in English, but I didn't always feel comfortable in English. Mainly, I could feel that comfort when I was talking with people who had a much deeper and stronger connection with, like, my best friends. The point is that I didn't always feel that comfy speaking in English. So where would I have found the comfort? And then I realized it was through reading books, listening to music like Rush and Ghost. Of course, music with English lyrics. And I thought about why that's important. And it's because the place where I lived in Georgia, in the South, was very English. I heard English, it was all around me. Of course, people in the South try to determine whether they will be friends with you, whether you've gone to church with them, or if you were always here. They didn't really ostracize actively. They would just kind of sometimes freeze you out, and that was pretty discouraging. But it wasn't like that with deaf people. And I'm sure some hearing people looked at me and could tell that I wasn't like them. And because of that, I didn't really belong. So what did I do? I read my books, played my video games, listened to music. Those are my friends. I did have a few real friends. And now that I live in the Netherlands, in a funny way, that's just continuing. I'm still reading and listening to music in English, and that provides me with that feeling of comfort. So, that's my video about signing and deaf culture and what those things mean for me. I will explain this in greater detail later on. Thank you for watching. Bye.